The roses at Manford Manor bloomed in defiance of the October chill, their deep crimson petals curled at the edges like secrets half told. Sarah had planted them herself in the first weeks of her marriage, pressing seeds into the cold earth with bare hands while the groundskeeper watched in barely concealed alarm. A duchess did not garden. A duchess directed others to garden. But Sarah had never been very good at being a duchess a circumflex euros, at least not the kind that Manford Manor seemed to expect. She knelt now between the rows, her gray mourning dress already smudged at the hem, her dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She turned a half-bloomed stem in her fingers and thought, as she often did in the early morning quiet, about her husband. 1 year. They had been married 1 year, and she still did not entirely know what she was to him. Edmund Manford, Duke of Ravensmore, was not a cruel man. She had braced herself for cruelty a circumflex euros, had been warned by well-meaning aunts that men of his station often wore their power like a second spine. But Edmund was not cruel. He was simply a euros sealed, polished to such a high finish that nothing seemed to penetrate the surface, and nothing from within seemed to escape. He was courteous at dinner. He was respectful in their private hours. He managed the estate with a quiet brilliance she genuinely admired. And sometimes a circumflex euros, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not name, something lodged between longing and restraint, before his face would smooth back into pleasant neutrality and the moment would dissolve. She had made the catastrophic mistake of falling in love with him sometime around February. She had not told him. She suspected she never would. Sarah set the rose stem down and pressed her palms flat against the soil, grounding herself as she heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She rose, brushed her hands against her skirts, and turned toward the manor. The woman stepping down from the carriage was the most beautiful person Sarah had ever seen in her life a circumflex euros, and she thought this without malice, only with the quiet devastation of someone who had just understood something they were not prepared to understand. She was tall, golden-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that managed to look like a portrait. She laughed at something the footman said, a bright careless laugh, and then she looked toward the manor's entrance and her face transformed into something even more luminous. Edmund stood at the top of the stone steps, and he smiled, not the careful, composed acknowledgement he offered at society functions, not the polite curvature of lips that Sarah had catalogued and studied like a scholar of small mercies. He smiled the way a person smiles when something long missed returns unexpectedly a circumflex euros, unguarded, unperformed, wholly real. "Cassandra," he said, and his voice carried easily across the drive. Sarah stood in her rose garden with soil on her hands and learned, in approximately 4 seconds, what it felt like to become invisible. She did not join them for luncheon. She sent word through Thomas that she had a headache a circumflex euros, her first lie to him, and it sat badly in her chest. She sat instead at her writing desk, staring at blank correspondence paper, listening to the faint murmur of voices from the drawing room below. Cassandra Ford's laugh rose easily through the floorboards. Edmund's voice, lower and indistinct, responded. Then laughter again. Shared laughter, the kind built on years of accumulated reference, the private architecture of a history she had no part in. Thomas appeared in the doorway, hesitated, and then came to stand beside the desk. Her hands were folded in that way she had when she was choosing words carefully. "Mrs. Howell says Lady Ford has been given the East guest suite," Thomas offered. "She is to stay the week." Sarah nodded as though this information were perfectly agreeable. "She's very beautiful," Sarah said, because naming it felt safer than circling it. Thomas said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The evening was worse. Sarah dressed carefully a circumflex euros, her best blue silk, her mother's pearl earrings a circumflex euros, and came down to dinner with her chin level and her composure intact. She smiled. She asked intelligent questions. She watched Cassandra hold the table's attention the way a flame holds a room's, effortlessly, without effort being the point. And she watched Edmund watch Cassandra, His reserve thawed to something approaching warmth, and she ate her soup and felt the distance between herself and her husband expand like a continent forming in real time. She excused herself early. No one pressed her to stay. She was halfway down the corridor toward her chambers when she heard their voices from the partially open study door, and her feet slowed without her permission. A circumflex euros, and you cannot tell me you don't see it. Cassandra's voice, lower now, stripped of its social brightness. Edmund, be honest. A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. She was always the one I should have chosen. His voice, Edmund's voice, low and unambiguous. Sarah stopped breathing. She did not hear what came after. The blood in her ears was too loud. She walked a circumflex euros very steadily. She was proud of how steadily a circumflex euros to her chambers, closed the door behind her without a sound, and stood in the center of the room until her legs stopped being reliable. She did not cry. Crying would have suggested surprise. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and thought very clearly, very calmly, about the geography of Manford Manor, about the roads leading out of it, about the old Weston cottage her father had left her, 12 miles east, where no one would think to look for a woman who had no business disappearing. She thought about love a circumflex euros, about what it cost to stay where you were not chosen. Then she rose and she began, very quietly, to pack. She left before the birds did. The note took 4 drafts. The first was 2 long a circumflex euros, explanations bleeding into accusations she had not intended to make. The second was too cold, reading more like a legal document than a farewell. The third said too much about love, which was precisely the thing she could not afford to leave behind in ink. The fourth was 7 words, unsigned, written in her steadiest hand on cream notepaper and placed on the vanity where it would be found but not immediately. Please do not search, I release you. She set her pearls beside it, then her wedding band. Then she picked the wedding band back up, held it for a long moment in her closed fist and placed it back on the vanity. Leaving it felt necessary. Leaving it felt like cutting off her own hand. She did both and did not let herself reconsider. Thomas was awake. Sarah had expected this a circumflex euros, had in truth been counting on it. She pressed the girl's hands between hers and asked for 2 things, silence and a half-hour's head start. Thomas wept without a sound, which Sarah thought was the most loyal thing anyone had ever done for her. She kissed the girl's forehead and stepped out into the dark. The carriage she hired was not a ducal carriage. It was a common one from the village, arranged the previous afternoon under the pretense of visiting a tenant's wife. The driver did not know her name. The road east was flat and featureless in the pre-dawn dark, and Sarah sat with her small trunk in her composed hands and watched Manford Manor disappear behind a tree line and told herself, with great firmness, that she was not looking back. She looked back. Edmund returned from his morning ride at 6:30 to a house that felt immediately, inexplicably wrong. He noticed it before he noticed anything specific a circumflex euros, that particular quality of silence that is not peaceful but held, the way a room goes quiet when the people inside it have been talking about you. He handed his horse off in the stable yard and took the front steps 2 at a time, with the formless urgency of a man following instinct he could not yet name. Mrs. Howell met him at the top of the stairs. Her face told him everything before her mouth opened. He read the note standing at Sarah's vanity, still in his riding coat, mud on his boots. He read it once, then again. Then he set it down with extraordinary care and stood very still for a moment, his hand flat on the vanity's surface. Those who knew Edmund Manford well a circumflex euros, and very few did a circumflex euros, would have recognized this stillness for what it was, not composure, its precise opposite. The stillness of a man absorbing something that has reorganized every fixed point in his interior world, and who is taking the half-second before movement to understand what direction is forward now. He moved. Within the hour he had spoken to every member of the household staff individually. His valet, the kitchen maids, the footman, the groundskeeper. He was not unkind a circumflex euros. He was never unkind a circumflex euros, but he was utterly without his usual careful courtesy, asking his questions with the stripped-down directness of someone who has run out of room for performance. Most of them had seen nothing. An undermaid had noticed a light in her Grace's chambers very late. Thomas, when he reached her, looked at the floor and cried and said she had given her word, which was when Edmund understood that Sarah had planned this, had held this plan inside her quietly while sitting across from him at dinner, and asking him about the eastern field drainage, and the understanding of it struck him somewhere well below language. He rode to the village himself. Later, those who witnessed it would tell the story for years. A circumflex Euros, the Duke of Ravensmore, still in his riding clothes, ducking through the door of Moswick's bakery to ask a red-cheeked woman kneading bread whether she had seen his wife before dawn. The baker's wife had not. He thanked her with genuine gravity and left. Lady Cassandra found him in the library at noon, standing at the window that overlooked the rose garden. He had not moved from it for some time. Edmund. Her voice was careful now, stripped of last night's ease. Come and sit. Let her a circumflex Euros. She was in this room 3 days ago, he said, without turning. She'd left a book on that chair with a pressed larkspur between the pages. I moved it without thinking. He paused. I should not have moved it. Cassandra crossed the room toward him. She'll have gone to her family, surely. You can send word a circumflex Euros. You should go home, Edmund said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply final, the way a closed door is final. He turned from the window and looked at her directly and said the thing that had been true for a very long time and that he had never found sufficient occasion to make plain. What we were to each other was real, and it was a long time ago, and I have wished you well every day since. But Cassandra a circumflex Euros, you were a chapter. Sarah is the entire book. Cassandra left the following morning. It was Thomas who broke, eventually, as Edmund had quietly trusted she would. Not because she was disloyal, but because she loved Sarah, and love has its own hierarchy of protections. She told him about the Weston cottage, 12 miles east. Her Grace had mentioned it once. She said a circumflex Euros, small, private. Her father's a circumflex Euros, the kind of place a person goes when they need to disappear without disappearing entirely. Edmund had his horse saddled before Thomas finished the sentence. He rode through the last of the afternoon and well into the dark, past the point where the road became more suggestion than certainty, through a stand of oaks that closed overhead like a cathedral, until a single lit window appeared at the edge of a clearing ahead. He stopped his horse. He sat for a moment in the dark and the cold, looking at that small, warm light. Then he dismounted and walked to the door and knocked. The knock came at the hour when night stops pretending it will last forever. Sarah had been sitting with a book she had not been reading, a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent an entire day being very brave and very alone. The cottage was small and honest a circumflex Euros, low ceilings, stone floors, a fireplace that required coaxing. She had coaxed it. She had coaxed everything since arriving, willing the space into something that felt like living rather than hiding, and she had very nearly succeeded. The knock undid all of it. She knew before she opened the door. She knew the way you know a storm is coming not from the sky but from something that shifts in your bones. She smoothed her skirts anyway a circumflex Euros, a ridiculous reflex, pure muscle memory a circumflex Euros, and crossed to the door and opened it. Edmund stood in the doorway with mud on his boots and exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and his eyes a circumflex Euros, those carefully managed, perpetually composed eyes a circumflex Euros, entirely undefended for the first time in the year she had known him. His hair was disheveled from riding. His cravat was loosened. He looked nothing like a duke and entirely like a man. Sarah stepped back and began to close the door. His hand came up and held it open, not forcefully. There was no force in it at all. It was the gesture of a man who understands he has no rights here and is asking with his entire self for a moment he has not earned. Please, he said, just that. One word, quiet as a confession. She stopped. She did not open the door wider. She did not close it further. She stood in the narrow space between and looked at him and waited, because she was not a woman who folded for presence alone, not even his, not even now. "You heard something in the study," he said. "I know what you heard. I need you to know what you did not hear." Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "I heard enough." "You heard 4 words lifted from the center of a longer truth." His voice did not rise. It never rose, but something in it was raw in a way she had no precedent for. "Cassandra told me she should have been chosen a circumflex euros, that I had made an error, that I had settled. She was making a case for herself, Sarah. And what I told her, a circumflex euros, what came directly after the words you heard, a circumflex euros, was that my only regret was not understanding sooner what I had, not choosing better. Understanding sooner." The fire crackled behind her. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks. "You expect me," Sarah said carefully, "to have walked away from my home and my roses and everything I had quietly made mine, a circumflex euros, on 7 words and no history of you ever once saying otherwise, a circumflex euros, and now return because you've clarified your phrasing." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "No." She waited. "I expect nothing," he said. "I drove here through the dark because the alternative was unthinkable, and I will say what I should have said long before you ever needed to overhear anything from anyone." He paused, and what happened to his face in that pause was something she would carry for the rest of her life. "May I come in?" It was not quite a question. She stepped back and let him in. He did not make speeches. She had half expected speeches, a circumflex euros. Edmund was, when required, a precise and eloquent man. Instead, he sat in the chair across from hers, forearms on his knees, and he simply began to list things. Quietly, specifically, without ornamentation. The morning in February when she had laughed at something the kitchen cat did, and the sound had been so unself-conscious and so entirely her that he had stood in the doorway and memorized it before she noticed him. The night in March when a tenant farmer's youngest child had taken a fever, and Sarah had sat up reading to the boy for 4 hours. Edmund had come to bring her home and found her asleep in the chair beside the child's bed with the book still open in her lap, and he had stood in that doorway too, and understood something about himself that he had not known how to act on. The letters she sent when he traveled to London, a circumflex euros, signed always, in her small even hand, your Sarah, a circumflex euros, and how those 2 words had become, without his quite deciding it, the fixed point his day arranged itself around. The rose garden, always the rose garden. The image of her on her knees in the cold earth with her hands in the soil, refusing to be the kind of Duchess that Manfred Manor expected, being instead the kind of woman she had decided to be, a circumflex euros. That image had become, without ceremony or announcement, the thing he thought of when he thought of home. He stopped. The fire had burned lower. The room was very quiet. Sarah was crying. Not the tidy, managed tears of public grief, but the full, helpless kind, the kind that comes from being seen so completely and so accurately that the self has nowhere left to hide. "I did not know," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Edmund, I truly did not know." "I know," he said. "That is my failure, entirely mine." She pressed her hands to her face. He did not move to her immediately, a circumflex euros. He gave her the moment, which was exactly right, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing he had ever done. Then she lowered her hands and looked at him and said, "Stay and have tea." He blinked almost imperceptibly. "Now." "Before we go back," she said. "Before the estate and the title and Mrs. Howell's opinions reclaim us both. 1 hour, just you, just me, tea." Something moved across his face, a circumflex euros, relief, and something warmer than relief, and something that had been sealed behind very expensive manners for a very long time. "Yes," he said. "All right." They returned to Manfred Manor with the morning. Sarah went directly to the rose garden. She had brought a cutting wrapped in damp cloth from the cottage windowsill, a circumflex euros, a small pale variety she had grown from seed, nothing aristocratic about it. She knelt in the familiar soil and pressed it carefully into the earth between the darker blooms. Edmund sat on the garden wall. He had never sat on the garden wall. It was not the sort of thing a Duke of Ravensmore did with a perfectly functional stone bench 3 feet away. But he sat on the wall and watched her work with his coat across his knee and his careful composure entirely, peacefully absent. Sarah pressed the last of the soil flat and looked up. He was already looking at her. He did not look away. The Duke had hunted his entire estate to find his Duchess. What he hadn't expected was to find himself in the searching.